The cruel plan. The wind howled through the cracks of the old farmhouse as darkness settled over the hills. Inside, 11-year-old Ava lay curled beneath a thin blanket on a mattress in the corner room. 6 months had passed since the car crash that took her mother's life and left her paralyzed from the waist down. Everything had changed after that tragic night. Her mother had been her warmth, her bedtime songs, her entire world. In her place now stood Raymond, the man her mother had trusted but who treated Ava like an unwanted burden. He never spoke her name gently, never looked at her without disgust. Ava's room had no wheelchair, no toys, no television. She crawled to reach the portable toilet in the corner. Meals were shoved through the door on a tray. The only treasure she had left was a tiny music box from her mother, but its winder had broken and it no longer sang. That night, Raymond came home drunk. His boots pounded unevenly through the hallway, his voice slurring curses into the empty air. Then came silence, followed by the creak of the back door. Minutes later, he returned dragging a thick iron chain. "Time to clean the slate," he muttered with a twisted grin. 2 weeks earlier, Brutus had arrived, a massive German shepherd with scars across his flanks and a permanent snarl. Raymond claimed the dog was ex-military, discharged after a deadly incident. He'd adopted Brutus from a shady kennel, believing he'd found the perfect solution to his problem. The dog lived chained outside by the barn, fed on a strict schedule. Raymond never touched him without thick gloves. To curious neighbors, he'd simply said, "This dog's exactly what this house needs." That night, Raymond stormed toward Ava's door. She looked up in alarm as he grabbed her arm roughly. Her screams echoed through the empty house as he dragged her outside, across the cold yard to the old equipment shed. The shed reeked of rust and damp earth. In the corner sat Brutus, now unchained, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. Raymond tossed Ava to the concrete floor. "There," he sneered. "Let nature take its course." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Ava alone with the beast in the suffocating darkness. Face to face with fear. Ava sobbed as she scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the cold concrete floor, her lifeless legs dragging behind her. Brutus rose to his full height, teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Outside, Raymond paused to listen for a moment, then smiled to himself before walking away. The sound of his truck faded into the distance, leaving only the growl of the beast just feet away. Ava curled herself tighter against the floor, heart pounding as Brutus remained motionless across the dim shed. His growl, at first low and menacing, began to fade. He stood still, head slightly lowered, his body tense yet not advancing. The seconds stretched like hours. She buried her face in her arms and wept, not just from terror, but from exhaustion. Her thin frame trembled with each sob, every breath short and ragged. Though she couldn't move her legs, she tried to inch away, pushing herself back with her palms, scraping her elbows raw against the concrete. Brutus did not follow. Instead, the massive dog slowly lowered himself to the ground. He rested his chin on his paws but kept his eyes locked on her. They weren't wild or angry, just watching, as if studying something he couldn't quite understand. A sudden rumble broke the silence. Ava froze. It was her stomach. The hollow ache inside her had been growing all evening, and now it spoke with an audible growl. She glanced at the dog, wide-eyed. Brutus lifted his head, ears twitching. Then, in the quiet, his own stomach answered with a deep, long groan. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ava, with eyes still red from crying, let out the smallest of laughs. It escaped her lips like something uninvited, a sound she hadn't made in weeks. "We're both hungry," she whispered. To her shock, Brutus's jaw parted slightly. He didn't growl. His tongue poked out and curled at the edge of his mouth. He looked almost relaxed. "You look like you're smiling," she murmured. Something flickered behind his eyes, something she couldn't explain but could feel. A stillness. A sadness. Maybe even recognition. An unexpected discovery. Slowly, Brutus began to crawl forward. Ava's breath caught in her throat, her hand tightening around the only thing she'd managed to bring from her room, her mother's old plastic keychain, a cracked ladybug that no longer lit up. Her mother used to hang it from the rearview mirror. After the crash, Ava had begged to keep it. Now it was all she had left. Brutus approached until he was just inches away, then stopped. He sniffed once, low and long, then sat in front of her, lowering his massive head. His nose nudged her trembling hand, and then, gently, he licked her knuckles. She didn't move, couldn't move. Her body was frozen, but her heart wasn't racing with terror anymore. Her fear was different now, uncertain rather than paralyzing. "My mom used to say," she whispered, "a good dog always looks into your eyes before doing anything. That's how you know their heart." Brutus lifted his head, his gaze meeting hers directly. He was truly looking, not just staring. She felt it, saw it in the depths of his dark eyes, pain that mirrored her own. Then, as if called by something inside, Brutus turned away. He walked across the shed to the far wall, sniffing the baseboards, pawing at a particular corner. His claws scraped against the wood, and Ava heard something shift. She turned her head to see what had caught his attention. There, behind some stacked crates, was a loose board. Brutus pawed at it more insistently, and it gave way with a soft creak. Moonlight streamed through the gap, not much, but enough to see that the board covered a hole leading outside. It was small, too small for Raymond to have noticed, but big enough for someone determined to squeeze through. Brutus looked back at her, then at the opening, as if trying to communicate something important. His tail gave the slightest wag, the first sign of anything other than aggression she'd seen from him. "You found a way out," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. But even as hope sparked in her chest, reality crashed down. The opening was several feet away, and she couldn't walk. How could she possibly reach it? As if reading her thoughts, Brutus padded back to her side. He lowered himself to the ground beside her, his warm fur brushing against her arm. For the first time in months, Ava felt something other than cold. The bond that changed everything. Hours passed in the shed. Ava found herself telling Brutus about her mother, about the music box that wouldn't sing anymore, about how scared she was every single day. The dog listened, his breathing steady and calm, occasionally shifting closer when her voice broke with emotion. "I don't understand why Raymond hates me so much," she whispered. "I never did anything to him." Brutus lifted his head and looked at her with those knowing eyes. Something in his gaze made her feel heard, understood in a way she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. As dawn approached, they heard Raymond's truck returning. Ava's body tensed with fear, but Brutus moved protectively closer, positioning himself between her and the door. The shed door creaked open, and Raymond stumbled in, expecting to find a gruesome scene. Instead, he found Ava alive and unharmed, with Brutus sitting calmly beside her. "What the hell?" Raymond snarled, his face twisting with rage. "You worthless mutt. You had one job." He lunged forward to grab Ava, but Brutus rose with a growl that was different this time, deeper, more menacing than any sound he'd made the night before. This wasn't the growl of a killer, it was the growl of a protector. Raymond stopped short, suddenly remembering why he'd been afraid to touch the dog without gloves. But something had changed. Brutus wasn't the same unpredictable beast he'd brought home. "Get away from her!" Raymond shouted, grabbing a rusty shovel from the wall. That's when Ava did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "He won't hurt me," she said clearly. "But he might hurt you if you try to touch me again." Brutus stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Raymond's path to Ava completely. The man's face went pale as he realized the tables had turned. "You think this changes anything?" Raymond spat, but his voice wavered. "You're still my problem to deal with." "No," came a voice from the doorway. "She's not." Everyone turned to see Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who lived a quarter-mile down the road. Behind her stood two police officers, their hands resting on their weapons as they took in the scene. "We got a call about shouting and a child screaming last night," one officer said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Raymond. "Seems we arrived just in time. Freedom and new beginnings." The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, explanations, and legal procedures. Raymond was arrested for child endangerment and abuse, his face full of shock that his plan had backfired so completely. Mrs. Henderson had heard Ava's screams the night before and, when she couldn't shake her worry, had called the authorities at dawn. She knelt beside Ava in the shed, her kind eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. "I should have checked on you sooner. I knew something wasn't right." As the paramedics prepared to take Ava to the hospital for evaluation, she looked back at Brutus, panic rising in her chest. "What will happen to him?" she asked urgently. "He saved me. He's not a bad dog, he was just scared and alone, like me." The animal control officer who had arrived looked skeptical. "This dog has been labeled dangerous, miss. He was brought in from a military discharge program." "Then test him," Ava said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. "Give him a real chance. Judge him by what he did last night, not by what someone else made him do." Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "If this child trusts him, maybe we should too. I'd be willing to foster them both while we sort this out." 3 months later, Ava sat in her new wheelchair on Mrs. Henderson's front porch, watching Brutus chase butterflies in the garden. The dog who had once been labeled vicious now wore a service dog vest, having passed every behavioral test with flying colors. He had been retrained as Ava's companion and mobility assistance dog. The bond they'd formed in that dark shed had become something beautiful and unbreakable. "You know," Mrs. Henderson said, settling into the chair beside her with 2 cups of hot chocolate, "I think your mother would be proud of how brave you've become." Ava smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Brutus's ears as he returned to her side. In her other hand, she held her mother's music box. Mrs. Henderson had found someone to fix the winding mechanism, and it played its gentle melody once again. "I think she sent him to me," Ava said softly. "Mom always said that love finds a way, even in the darkest places." Brutus looked up at her with those same knowing eyes, his tail wagging gently. He had found his purpose, and she had found her courage. Together, they had discovered that sometimes the most unlikely friendships are forged in the most desperate moments, and that compassion can flourish even where cruelty was meant to reign. As the sun set over their new home, Ava realized that while she might never walk again, she was no longer broken. She had found her strength, her protector, and most importantly, her hope for the future. The end.